Hi everyone, my name is Emily Clark. I'm a speech language pathologist at KidsAbility, and we're here today to chat about speech sound development. I'll start off my presentation by explaining what an SLP does. We'll then move on to differentiating between speech and language and what typical speech development looks like. After that, I'll go through what it may look like when things go wrong in this area, some cultural considerations, and possible repercussions of things going wrong with speech sound development. I'll explain the role of the SLP in the management of disordered speech sound development, and give an outline of the most common approach to remediating such delays. At the end, I'll give a few quick classroom tips and tricks, and then open the floor up for questions. For those of you watching this presentation online, you're welcome to email in any questions, and I'll do my best to get to you. Before we get started, just a disclaimer: this presentation is not intended to offer medical advice and should not be relied upon as a substitute for professional consultation with a qualified healthcare professional. So, speaking of speech, what is a speech language pathologist? So, SLPs work with people of all ages, babies to adults. We treat many types of communication as following problems. These include problems with speech sounds, which we'll get into today. Language, so what we understand and how we express ourselves. Literacy, reading and writing, social communication, how well we follow social rules, like taking turns, how to talk to different people, or how close to stand when someone is talking. This is also called pragmatics, voice disorders, fluency, also called stuttering. It's how well speech flows. Someone who stutters might repeat sounds or sound like they get stuck at times. Cognitive communication, and feeding and swallowing, which is less spoken about. Honing in on speech and language, speech is the sound of spoken language and includes the formation of a sound, the nature of the sound, and the rhythm and flow of that sound. Language is the words we understand and produce, whether it be as single words or in sentences, to share ideas and get what we want. So, if I say, "The thief stole my lemon tree, he was locked up in that place where all bad people get locked up." The speech or articulation errors were my pronunciation of thief and tree, and the language errors were my sentence structure and vocabulary, lack of vocabulary for prison. Today's presentation is about speech development, not language. So typically children may say some sounds wrong when they're learning to talk. They learn some sounds earlier, like the or w sounds. Other sounds take a bit longer to learn, like the z, or r sounds. Most children can say almost all speech sounds correctly by 4 years old, but some do take a little bit longer. So the chart you guys can see gives an idea of a consonant development, but we can go back even further. At 3 months, cooing starts. 5 months, we usually hear laughs, playful sounds. At 6 months, babies usually start making speech-like babbling sounds. They might be starting with pa, ba, me, mi, da. By 1 year old, babies' babbles are a little bit longer and they start sounding more like words. You might even get your first word around this time, but we are still again focusing on the speech sounds themselves, so not necessarily the words. Then, as you can see on the chart, by 3 years old, we expect the h, w, b, t, d, k, g, and sounds to have come through in words. Familiar people understand a child's speech by around 4 years old, but they might still make some mistakes, especially in connected speech with those more difficult ones like the sh, j, and then as you can see here, the th and r sounds kind of come through last. So what happens when things go wrong? Speech sound disorders is an umbrella term referring to any difficulty or combination of difficulties with perception, motor production, phonological representation of speech sounds and speech segments. Speech sound disorders can be organic or functional. As you can see in the diagram, it kind of illustrates that quite nicely there. Organic speech sound disorders result from an underlying motor, neurological, structural, sensory cause, where functional speech sound disorders are idiopathic, so we don't really know what the cause is. Organic speech sound disorders include those resulting from motor neurological disorders, so praxia of speech or dysarthria, structural abnormalities like a cleft lip and palate or other structural deficits. Sensory disorders like hearing loss, and then functional sound disorders, or functional speech sound disorders, include those related to motor production of speech sounds and those related to linguistic aspects of speech production. Historically, these disorders are referred to as articulation and phonological disorders, respectively. Our functional speech disorders will be most commonly dealt with in the general school setting. So, here we get into our phonological disorders. So, phonological disorders focus on predictable rule-based errors that affect more than one sound. Like in fronting, you'll hear a child say cow or cow. Or we see a variety of posterior sounds like the k and the g sounds being transferred to the fronts. So they'll use either a t or a d instead of those. Other examples, so the stopping is quite a common one, where a child might say pan for fan or dump for jump. With this process, we see a variety of long sounds like the or being substituted for a short abrupt sound like a d or a t. And then final constant deletion, that's self-explanatory, and an example of that is the child might say toad for toad. That final sound is left off. An articulation delay or disorder focuses, or when we refer to articulation disorders, refer to an individual who's struggling with one specific sound or a variety of specific sounds. And that sound will be distorted or they'll present with substitutions in the production of that single sound. Now, if we go back to the typical speech sound development chart, you can kind of gauge if the articulation area is immature or not. It's often difficult to clearly differentiate between articulation and phonological disorders. But it's necessary to note that phonological processes or error patterns will be considered immature or may be considered immature before a specific articulation error is considered immature. For example, stopping of the S sound is considered immature after the age of 3, but we don't expect a child to be proficient in using the S sound specifically before the age of 4. So the differentiation is important in order to effectively manage the error or the error pattern. Another tool that can be used as a reference is how much of a child's speech is clearly understood by unfamiliar parties. So this is known as an intelligibility rating. At 3 years old, approximately 68% of their speech should be clearly intelligible. By 3.5, 78%, 4, around 86%, 4.5, yes, it jumps up to 91%, and then by 5 years old, 94% should be intelligible, and by 6, 97% of the connected speech should be clearly intelligible. If their intelligibility rate is lower than this, it's likely that there's some sort of speech delay at play. So how common are speech sound disorders? Overall, it's been found that 2.3 to 24.6% of school-aged children may have speech delays or speech sound disorders. Boys have been found to struggle more than girls, and reports estimate that between 11 and 40% of children with speech sound disorders have concomitant language impairment of sorts. So I know that range is quite large there, 2.3 to 26.4, but just based on the research that is available, and it would be in a variety of populations and using references. But we get the idea that usually there are quite a number of children in any given class that will be presenting with such difficulties. In a place like Yemen, where we have such incredible diversity, it's particularly important to keep the cultural and linguistic considerations in mind. Languages across the world have unique phonemic systems. For individuals learning English as a second language, it's common for the phonemic system of their first language to influence the production of their sounds in English. So if we look at Spanish, for example, you'll notice that there are only a handful of sounds that overlap between the two languages. A child exposed to only Spanish in the first couple of years of life will have difficulty with the English sounds, and vice versa. This is where it becomes imperative to consider the environment and the expectations of the child across the board. An accent is the unique way that speech is pronounced by a group of people speaking the same language, and it's a natural part of the spoken language. No accent is better than another. Accents, like dialects, are not speech or language disorders, but rather only reflect differences. Not all substitutions and omissions are speech errors. Instead, they may be related to a feature of a speaker's dialect. Dialectal variations of a language may cross all linguistic parameters, including phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. I'm sure we can all think of examples of this. A common one that I've seen here in the Cayman Islands is the substitution of the th sound, so for either a t or a d sound. So we'll hear tree for three, or d for the. And depending on the background of the child, this may or may not be acceptable. When challenged by these considerations and variations in the context of your classrooms, you may want to ask yourself the following questions. Are the differences affecting their intelligibility? So, is everyone able to understand the child? Is it affecting their confidence? Is it affecting their participation? And is it affecting their academics? So you don't want to see a child withdrawing from group activities or class discussions because they're being made fun of, or they're not being understood, they're becoming self-conscious. So if the answer to any of these questions is yes, they're likely to benefit from some sort of additional support, whether it be an assessment, um, discussion. Yeah. So speech, sound development, and literacy. Reading is a complex action that involves a proficient development and interplay of multiple skills. Of these skills, early phonological awareness is a powerful indicator of later reading abilities. Broadly, phonological awareness is the conscious understanding that a spoken language is made up of separate segments of sounds. Now we can quickly draw links between speech sound awareness and phonological awareness. But this phonological awareness is a powerful skill and it begins in infancy. So babies recognize native speech sounds. Then many young children use the same skill to develop receptive and expressive language and to self-correct speech errors. Proficient underlying phonological representations help children develop necessary speech, language, and literacy skills. However, children with speech sound disorders often struggle to develop strong underlying phonological representations. So this is where we see the link between the speech sound disorders and difficulties with reading later on. So you have a child that you're concerned about, and think they'll benefit from some additional support. The role of an SLP is to make sure that, for one, that the community knows what the signs and symptoms of these speech sound disorders are and where to find help. Then to provide appropriate screening, assessment, and individualized treatment plans where necessary. It may involve referring kids on, and of course, we have a responsibility to add to the research in the field, which is often a privilege to be able to get involved in. The most common process or approach to articulation therapy follows this process here. So the trouble sounds are generally targeted from the most delayed to the least delayed. So again, going back to that typical development chart, we'll see which are the most immature sounds that they're unable to produce and targeted from the bottom up. First, the sound that needs to be mastered in isolation. So just an example here, if we're targeting the S sound, we would want a child to be able to spontaneously produce the S sound just in isolation. So once they've mastered that, we'd like to stick to an 80% accuracy. If they're able to produce it in isolation 80% of the time, we can then move on to syllables. So si, sa, se, si, so, su in the beginning, and as, es, is, os, us in the final position of syllables. And then we move up this hierarchy in words, in phrases, sentences, stories, structured conversation, and then work towards generalization. Homework will change. Will change as we work through the process, and it's quite important to be in constant communication with the SLP on the case, so that we're not putting pressure or undue expectations on the child as he works or as they work through this process. In the context of the classroom, you can try the following strategies to support kids that are struggling with their speech. Modeling and recasting. So if you notice an error and repeat the child's sentence if it's not clear. So, for example, if they say, "Dat my Dean tar," as an adult, you can say, "Yes, that's your green car." By repeating what the child said to you, you're producing a good model, and you're also showing that you've listened to the child, um, and acknowledging their communication attempt. Then it's always important to listen and respond to the message as opposed to the exact pronunciation of those words. Um, Encourage gesture and signs to complement the child's speech if it's highly unintelligible. And then chat with the SLP about, or with the child's SLP if there is one involved, about an individualized plan to help the child's clarity and use of speech in the classroom. You use fun, play-based activities or games to help motivate the child to learn, as both any activity or learning task in the classroom. The more fun, the better, and more success. If you're interested in reading a bit more about the content I've covered, feel free to check out the references I've listed here. And as mentioned earlier, feel free to email in any questions you may have. Thank you all for taking time out to listen to this presentation.